The detective stopped in the doorway, and for a moment his mind simply refused to process what he was seeing. There, in the center of an otherwise ordinary living room, lay a human leg. Just a leg. From the knee down, pale and untouched, wearing a slipper that looked absurdly domestic against the horror of the scene. Around it, in a grotesque halo roughly 3 feet in diameter, lay a pile of fine gray ash. That was all that remained of a human being. But here's what made seasoned investigators feel their skin crawl. The armchair, positioned less than 2 feet from where the body had been, showed no signs of fire damage. Not a scorch mark, not a singe on the floral upholstery. The carpet beneath the ash was barely discolored. A stack of newspapers on a side table, close enough that the victim could have reached out and touched them in their final moments, sat crisp and unburned. The walls bore no trace of smoke. The windows had not cracked from heat. By every law of physics and fire science that these investigators understood, what they were looking at should not exist. This was not the scene of a house fire. This was something else entirely. Can the human body ignite from within? Can flesh and bones spontaneously burst into flames hot enough to reduce a person to cinders, yet contained enough to leave a newspaper intact inches away? Every instinct, every piece of scientific training, every rational thought screams no way. The human body is not kindling. We are mostly water. Our tissues do not simply combust. Fire needs fuel, oxygen, and an ignition source. Fire spreads. Fire consumes everything in its path. Fire does not politely stop at an invisible boundary, respecting the furniture while utterly destroying only the human being. And yet, there are the photographs. Police evidence files documenting the impossible. Black and white images from decades past, color photographs from more recent years, all showing the same inexplicable pattern. Now, a pile of ash where a person used to be. Sometimes a leg remaining, sometimes both legs, occasionally an arm. The extremities seemingly spared, while the torso, the center of the body, reduced to fine powder. And surrounding these human remains, a room that looks like nothing happened at all. The cases are not ancient folklore whispered around campfires. They are modern incidents with official documentation, with fire marshals shaking their heads in disbelief, with coroners unable to provide satisfactory explanations. There are witness statements from people who smelled something burning and found their loved ones transformed into ash. There are investigators who have spent careers trying to explain what they saw and found no answers that satisfy the evidence before them. In case after case, the pattern repeats with disturbing consistency. No signs of struggle, no evidence of accelerants, no electrical faults or nearby ignition sources. Just a human being who appears to have burned from the inside out with such intense heat that bone itself turned to powder, while simultaneously generating so little external heat that flammable materials nearby remained pristine. The contradiction is absolute. The evidence is undeniable. This is the phenomenon that has haunted forensic science for centuries, lurking in police files and coroner reports like an unsolvable riddle. Some cases are famous, their details debated by scientists and skeptics. Others remain obscure, filed away in departmental archives, uncomfortable mysteries that defy explanation. Together, they form a pattern that cannot be easily dismissed, yet cannot be easily explained. In the pages ahead, you will encounter these cases. Real people, real deaths, real investigations. You will walk through the rooms where the impossible occurred. You will hear from the witnesses who discovered the remains. You will follow investigators as they attempt to apply reason and science to scenes that seem to mock both. And you will confront the central question that has never been adequately answered. How can a human body burn with such intensity while leaving the world around it untouched? The answer, if there is one, lies somewhere in the intersection of chemistry, physics, and the unsettling unknown. The morning of the 28th of March, 1731, began like any other in the grand palazzo of Countess Cornelia Bandi. Servants moved quietly through the marble halls of her Cesena residence, their footsteps echoing against ancient stone. But when the Countess's personal maid climbed the sweeping staircase to her mistress's bedchamber, she walked into a scene that would haunt medical science for centuries to come. The door opened to reveal something that should not exist. Something that defied every law of nature the 18th century understood. The Countess was gone. Not missing, but transformed into something incomprehensible. Where a 62-year-old noblewoman should have been sleeping, there remained only two pale legs, still clad in their white stockings, ending abruptly at the knees. Between these limbs sat a small pile of ash, unremarkable except for what it represented, and nearby, a skull. Intact, but somehow reduced, as if the fire that had consumed the Countess had known precisely where to stop and where to continue. The maid's screams brought the household running. What they found in that chamber would become the subject of letters, medical treatises, and whispered conversations across Europe for generations. The room itself told a story that made no sense. A thick, greasy soot coated every surface. The walls bore an oily yellow film that seemed to seep from nowhere. The furniture, once elegant pieces befitting Italian nobility, now wore a peculiar coating of fatty residue. The windows were filmed with a substance that felt wrong to the touch, viscous and unnatural. Yet the bed itself, where the Countess should have been consumed by whatever fire had taken her, remained untouched. The linens showed no char marks. No scorched patterns marked the mattress. The wooden frame bore no evidence of heat. More disturbing still, a small oil lamp sat on the bedside table, its reservoir full, its contents completely unused. Whatever had generated enough heat to reduce a human body almost entirely to ash had somehow done so without igniting the most flammable object in the room. The authorities arrived, followed swiftly by physicians. Among them was Giuseppe Bianchini, a canon of the church and a man of considerable medical learning. His examination of the scene would become the first truly detailed documentation of what would later be called spontaneous human combustion. But in 1731, no such term existed. There was only mystery and horror, and the physical evidence that refused to make sense. Bianchini approached his investigation with the methodical precision expected of Enlightenment-era science. He documented everything. The position of the legs, still upright, as if the Countess had been standing or sitting when whatever happened to her began. The ash pile, which he carefully measured and noted, weighed remarkably little for what should have been an entire human torso, arms, and most of a head. The skull, which retained its structure despite apparent exposure to extreme heat. He examined the walls, scraping samples of the greasy coating. It felt organic, fatty, like rendered tallow. The smell in the room, witnesses reported, was distinctive but difficult to describe. Not the familiar scent of wood smoke or burning fabric. Something else. Something meat-like, but also chemical. Several servants became ill from the odor and had to leave the palazzo entirely. Bianchini measured the room's dimensions. He noted the distance from the ash pile to the nearest furnishings. He catalogued every object in the chamber and its condition. The extreme localization of the burning became his central puzzle. How could heat intense enough to cremate a human body, which typically requires temperatures exceeding 1600 degrees, manifest in such a confined space without spreading, without igniting nearby materials, without leaving scorch marks on the floor itself? The floor beneath where the Countess had been showed no charring. This detail troubled Bianchini more than almost any other. Fire rises, yes, but it also radiates outward. It conducts through materials. It spreads. Yet here, it had somehow remained focused on a single human body, leaving the surrounding environment largely intact, save for that terrible coating of residue. Bianchini interviewed the household staff extensively. The Countess, they reported, had been in good health for her age. She had dined normally the previous evening. Her habits were unremarkable. She did not smoke tobacco. She kept no unusual chemicals in her chambers. The fire had been properly banked in the distant fireplace. No candles had been left burning. The oil lamp, as noted, remained full and unused. One detail emerged that Bianchini found noteworthy. The Countess had apparently been fond of camphorated brandy, which she rubbed on her body to ease the aches of aging. Some witnesses suggested she had done so before retiring that final night. Could this have contributed? Bianchini tested the theory, soaking fabric in the same preparation and attempting to ignite it. The material burned, certainly, but in a normal fashion. It did not produce the intense, localized heat necessary to explain the scene before him. The maid who discovered the body reported one additional peculiarity. When she had first approached the door that morning, she had noticed a strange glow visible beneath it. A yellowish light, she said, unlike candlelight or dawn filtering through windows. When she opened the door, the light was gone, replaced only by the smoke-filled chamber and its impossible contents. Bianchini's final report, published later that same year, represented the most thorough examination of such a phenomenon to date. But for all his careful observation and scientific methodology, he could offer no satisfactory explanation. He ruled out conventional fire. He dismissed the possibility of murder, finding no evidence of accelerants or external ignition sources. He acknowledged the camphorated brandy but could not demonstrate how it might have caused such devastation, while leaving the room itself relatively unscathed. The church initially suspected divine intervention, perhaps judgment rendered against some hidden sin. But Bianchini, despite his religious position, resisted this interpretation. The evidence, he argued, suggested a natural phenomenon, even if it was one completely unknown to contemporary science. This insistence on seeking natural, rather than supernatural explanations, marked a crucial shift in how such cases would be approached in the centuries to come. Word of the Countess's death spread throughout Italy and beyond. Letters describing the case reached Paris, London, Vienna. Medical men debated the findings in coffee houses and universities. Some proposed that certain individuals might somehow accumulate flammable humors within their bodies. Others suggested unknown chemical reactions occurring in living tissue under specific conditions. A few whispered about stranger possibilities, about fires that burned from within rather than without. But what troubled many observers most was the implication of Bianchini's documentation. If this could happen once, it could happen again. If the human body could somehow become fuel for an impossible fire, then everyone was potentially at risk from a danger they could neither predict nor prevent. And they were right to worry. Because the Countess Cornelia Bandi was not the first to burn this way. She was merely the first to be documented with scientific rigor. Throughout history, whispers had circulated of people found reduced to ash. Medieval texts made oblique references to unexplained deaths by fire. Local legends in various regions spoke of people who burned from within. But these accounts had been dismissed as folklore, as exaggeration, as superstition. Bianchini's report changed that. Here was a credible witness, a man of science and standing, describing in careful detail something that should not exist. And once documented, the pattern became visible. Over the following decades and centuries, similar cases would emerge. Different countries, different circumstances, but always the same core elements. A body reduced to ash. Legs sometimes remaining. Extreme heat confined to an impossibly small area. Surroundings relatively undamaged. No clear ignition source. No satisfactory explanation. The case of Countess Bandi established that this phenomenon, whatever it was, followed rules we did not understand. It showed preferences we could not predict. It manifested in ways that violated everything science knew about fire and combustion. And perhaps most disturbing of all, it suggested that the human body itself could become something other than what we believed it to be. Not just flesh and bone and blood, but potentially fuel for a fire we could neither explain nor escape. In her elegant bedchamber in Cesena, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and nobility, Countess Cornelia Bandi became more than a victim. She became evidence, proof that an ancient horror walked among us, patient and inexplicable, waiting in the darkness for reasons we could not fathom. And in the greasy soot that coated her walls, in the impossible preservation of that oil lamp, in the terrible specificity of the burning, lay a question that haunts us still. What fire burns so hot, yet so precisely? What force reduces human flesh to ash, but spares cotton bedding inches away? And most terrifying of all, what makes a body choose to burn? Ash. The morning heat was already oppressive when Pansy Carpenter climbed the stairs to the second-floor apartment at 171 5th Street North, in St. Petersburg, Florida. It was July 2nd, 1951, and the sun had barely cleared the horizon, yet the air hung thick and humid, typical for a summer morning in the Peninsula State. But what awaited her behind that apartment door was anything but typical. Mrs. Carpenter was the landlady, a capable woman who managed her rooming house with the kind of attention that came from years of dealing with tenants of all sorts. Her tenant in the upstairs apartment, Mrs. Mary Reeser, was a quiet woman, 67 years old, pleasant enough, reliable with the rent. The previous evening, Pansy had seen Mary in her nightgown and housecoat, comfortable in the Florida heat, preparing to settle in for the night. Everything had seemed perfectly normal. But this morning, something felt wrong. A Western Union messenger had arrived with a telegram for Mrs. Reeser. Pansy took it upon herself to deliver it personally, as she often did. She made her way up the stairs, the telegram in hand, perhaps mentally noting the unusual warmth even for this humid climate. When she reached the door to apartment B, she extended her hand toward the doorknob. The moment her fingers made contact with the metal, she yanked her hand back with a startled cry. The doorknob was scorching hot, almost too hot to touch, radiating heat that had no business being there on any morning, no matter how warm the Florida summer. Her heart immediately began to race. Something was terribly wrong. Fire. There had to be a fire inside. But she smelled no smoke, heard no crackling flames, saw nothing through the gap beneath the door. Pansy did what any reasonable person would do when confronted with such a mystery. She called for help. Two painters who happened to be working across the street heard her distressed calls and came running. Together, after a moment's hesitation, and with considerable force, they pushed open the door to apartment B. What they found defied every expectation, every logical explanation, every experience any of them had with fire or death or the natural order of things. The apartment was not engulfed in flames. There was no raging inferno, no walls ablaze, no furniture consumed by fire. Instead, they saw something far more disturbing, far more impossible. In the center of the room, in a circular area no more than 4 feet in diameter, complete and utter destruction had occurred. And at the heart of this small circle of devastation sat the remains of what had been Mrs. Mary Reeser died. To call what remained of her a body would be generous to the point of absurdity. Mary Reeser had been a large woman, not unusually so, but substantial. She had weighed approximately 175 pounds. What sat in that burned-out chair amounted to less than 10 pounds of ash and bone fragments. The chair itself had been almost completely consumed, its springs and metal frame twisted and warped, still recognizable as furniture, but transformed by heat that must have been extraordinary. But it was the specific details that made even the most hardened investigators pause, that made rational men question what their eyes were telling them. Mrs. Reeser's skull had not simply burned. It had shrunk. The human skull is bone, solid and substantial, and while intense heat can certainly damage bone, what had happened here was different. Her skull had been reduced to the size of a baseball, blackened and shrunken like something that had been subjected to temperatures beyond what any normal fire could produce. The visual was grotesque, nightmarish, the kind of thing that would haunt everyone who saw it for the rest of their lives. Her torso had been entirely consumed, reduced to a fine ash that crumbled at the slightest disturbance. Her ribs, her spine, her pelvis, all gone, all transformed into powder that bore little resemblance to what had once been human bone. One might expect that such complete incineration would leave nothing recognizable at all, but human remains are strange in their inconsistency, because one part of Mrs. Reeser had survived almost completely intact. Her left foot, still wearing its black satin slipper, remained. It sat apart from the main scene of destruction, separated from the body at the knee. The foot looked almost normal, as if it could have been attached to a living person just moments before. The slipper showed signs of charring, but the foot itself was recognizable, complete, a bizarre testament to the selective nature of whatever had consumed the rest of Mary Reeser. The apartment around this 4-foot circle of destruction told an even stranger story. The walls directly above where Mrs. Reeser had sat were covered in a greasy black soot, but only up to a certain height. Above, approximately 4 feet from the floor, the walls were clean, unmarked, as if an invisible barrier had contained the smoke and heat. This was not how normal fires behave. Fire rises. Heat rises. Smoke billows upward and spreads. Yet here, something had kept the damage confined, restricted, localized in a way that made no physical sense. The electrical outlets nearest to the scene of destruction had melted, their plastic covers warped and deformed by intense heat. The mirror on the wall had cracked. A candle had melted into a puddle of wax. These were the kinds of details one might expect near a fire hot enough to cremate a human body. But then there were the inconsistencies, the impossibilities that kept piling up. A pile of newspapers sat on a table near the burned area. Newspapers, those most flammable of household items, the kind of thing that catches fire if you so much as look at it wrong. They were untouched, not singed, not even discolored. Nearby, a pile of linens remained intact. The carpet beneath the circular burn area showed damage, but the fire had not spread beyond that defined circle. It was as if the flames, or whatever had caused this destruction, had been confined to a cylinder of space, burning with impossible intensity in one small area, while leaving everything else relatively untouched. The St. Petersburg Police Department arrived first, followed quickly by the fire marshal, and then, in a move that underscored just how strange and significant this case was considered, the Federal Bureau of Investigation sent agents to examine the scene. The FBI does not typically involve itself in what might appear to be a simple accidental death or house fire. Their presence spoke volumes about how seriously authorities took the inexplicable nature of Mary Reeser's death. Investigators photographed everything. They measured the burn patterns, analyzed the ash, examined every possible source of ignition. They interviewed witnesses, reconstructed Mrs. Reeser's final evening, looked for any evidence of foul play or accelerants or any external factor that might explain the impossible scene before them. The details of that final evening were simple and ordinary. Mary Reeser had taken 2 sleeping pills, a common practice for someone of her age dealing with the discomforts of Florida summer nights. Her son Richard had visited her around 9 o'clock in the evening and found her sitting in her chair, wearing her nightgown, housecoat, and those black satin slippers. She was smoking a cigarette. He noticed nothing unusual, no indication that anything was wrong. He said goodnight and left, believing his mother would simply fall asleep in her chair, as she sometimes did. A neighbor reported seeing smoke around 5 o'clock in the morning but thought little of it. In an apartment building in 1951, someone was always burning something, cooking something, smoking something. It did not seem worthy of investigation at the time. The FBI investigation lasted weeks. Agents consulted with fire experts, with crematorium operators, with anyone who might have insight into how a human body could be so completely incinerated in the middle of a small apartment, without burning down the entire building. The temperatures required to reduce human bone to ash, to shrink a skull, to so completely consume soft tissue, were extraordinary. Professional crematoriums operated at temperatures exceeding 1600 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours to achieve complete cremation. How could such heat be generated and sustained in a small apartment without spreading? The official conclusion, when it finally came, satisfied almost no one who had seen the evidence. The FBI determined that Mrs. Reeser had likely fallen asleep in her chair while smoking. Her cigarette had ignited her nightgown, perhaps her housecoat. Her body fat, once ignited, had acted as fuel, creating what is known as the wick effect. In this theory, the human body essentially becomes a candle. The clothing acts as a wick, and the body's fat melts and burns, creating a self-sustaining fire that can burn for hours at relatively low temperatures, gradually consuming the body. The wick effect is a real phenomenon. It has been demonstrated under controlled conditions. Bodies wrapped in fabric and ignited will indeed burn slowly, the fat fueling the flames. But the wick effect typically requires very specific conditions. The body usually remains more or less in place, burning slowly and incompletely. It does not explain the shrunken skull. It does not explain the complete consumption of bone to fine ash. It does not explain the circular pattern of destruction or the wall soot that stopped at an invisible line. Crematorium operators pointed out the obvious problems. Even in their specialized facilities designed specifically to incinerate human remains at extremely high temperatures, it took hours to achieve complete cremation, and even then, recognizable bone fragments always remain. Those fragments had to be mechanically pulverized to create the fine ash that families receive. Yet Mrs. Reeser's remains showed almost no intact bone structure, except for that inexplicable foot. The shrunken skull particularly bothered medical examiners. While extreme heat can certainly damage and fragment a skull, the specific type of shrinkage observed did not match known patterns of thermal damage. Some compared it to the shrunken heads created by certain South American tribes, but those were created through an entirely different process involving the removal of the skull bone itself. The 4-foot circle of destruction remained the most troubling detail. Fire does not respect invisible boundaries. It spreads to whatever fuel is available. The fact that newspapers and linens just outside that circle remained untouched while metal outlets within the circle melted suggested temperatures and burn patterns that defied conventional fire behavior. In the years since that July morning in 1951, the Mary Reeser case has become one of the most studied and debated examples of what some call spontaneous human combustion. Skeptics insist the Wick effect explains everything, that the unusual details are simply the result of rare but natural circumstances aligning in an unexpected way. Believers point to the impossibilities, the inconsistencies, the things that do not quite fit the official narrative. What remains undisputed is that something extraordinary happened in that apartment. A woman died in a manner so complete, so intense, so localized, that it challenged the understanding of everyone who investigated it. The doorknob that burned Pansy Carpenter's hand that morning was just the beginning of a mystery that continues to resist easy explanation. A reminder that sometimes the official answer, no matter how confidently delivered, fails to account for the impossible details that refuse to be explained away. Don Gosnell had been reading gas meters in Coudersport, Pennsylvania for long enough that he could walk most routes with his eyes half closed. The small town tucked into the hills of Potter County held few surprises for a utility worker who had seen the inside of nearly every basement and crawl space in the area. On the morning of December 5, 1966, he approached the home of Dr. John Irving Bentley with the same routine efficiency he brought to every house on his route. The doctor was 92 years old, a retired physician who had spent decades serving the community. Gosnell knew the elderly man lived alone in the 2-story building that also housed his former medical practice. He knocked on the door as a courtesy, waited the customary moment, then let himself in through the entrance that provided access to the basement where the meter waited. The first thing that struck him was the smell. It wasn't the musty odor of an old basement or the familiar scent of heating oil and concrete. This was something else entirely, something that made him pause on the stairs. The air carried a sweet, heavy quality that seemed to coat the back of his throat. Acrid. Chemical. Delay. And underneath it all, something that reminded him disturbingly of a cookout, of meat left too long on a grill. He continued down the steps, his hand on the rail, his mind already trying to categorize what he was smelling, to fit it into some framework that made sense. The basement itself appeared normal at first glance. Gosnell had been in this space dozens of times before. Same furnace, same water heater, same concrete floor and wooden support beams. But as he moved toward the meter, he looked up and froze. In the ceiling above him, directly beneath what he knew to be the first-floor bathroom, there was a hole. Not a small hole. Not a crack or a gap in the floorboards. This was a ragged opening approximately 2 feet by 3 feet, burned straight through the wooden floor. The edges were charred black, and through the opening, he could see the base of the white porcelain toilet above. Directly beneath this opening, on the basement floor, was a pile of ash. Gosnell stepped closer, his professional duty to read the meter completely forgotten now. The pile looked disturbingly substantial, a mound of grayish-white powder and darker fragments. He knew ash. He had seen the remains of burned wood, burned paper, burned fabric. This looked different. The texture was finer in some places, chunkier in others. Among the ash, he could make out what appeared to be small pieces of something denser, fragments that had not completely combusted. He didn't touch anything. Something primal in his mind told him not to disturb whatever he was looking at. Instead, Don Gosnell did what any sensible person would do when confronted with something beyond normal explanation. He went back upstairs, found the telephone, and called for help. His voice, according to later reports, was shaking when he spoke to the dispatcher. He didn't say there had been a fire. He didn't say Dr. Bentley was injured. He simply said that something was very wrong at the Bentley residence, and they needed to send someone immediately. The firefighters arrived within minutes. Coudersport was a small town where everyone knew everyone, and the volunteer fire department took their responsibility seriously. They entered the building expecting perhaps a smoldering fire, maybe evidence of a fall or a medical emergency. What they found in the upstairs bathroom would become the subject of investigation, speculation, and debate for decades to come. The bathroom door was open. Inside, the room appeared almost completely normal. The walls were intact. The paint was not blistered or blackened. The window was closed, the glass uncracked. The bathtub stood white and clean against one wall. Towels hung on their rack. A medicine cabinet above the sink held its usual contents, nothing melted or disturbed. But in the floor, near the toilet, there was that hole burned straight through to the basement below. And beside the toilet, on the intact linoleum floor, was the lower portion of a human leg. The leg was severed cleanly at the knee, or rather, at what would have been the knee if there had been anything left above it. The flesh ended abruptly, and above that termination point, there was nothing. No body, no torso, no arms or head, just that single lower leg, still wearing a brown slipper, standing upright as if Dr. Bentley had simply evaporated from the knee up. The foot was positioned naturally, the way a leg would stand if someone were sitting on the toilet. The slipper showed no signs of burning. The exposed portion of leg showed no charring, no indication that fire had touched it at all. Perhaps even more unsettling was the walker. Dr. Bentley had used an aluminum walker to move around his house, a common sight for a man of his advanced age and declining mobility. The walker stood approximately 4 feet from the toilet, closer to the door. It was positioned upright, perfectly normal, completely untouched by flame. The rubber grips on the handles were intact. The metal showed no discoloration from heat. It stood there in mute testimony to the impossibility of what the firefighters were witnessing. One of the first firefighters on scene, a man who had served with the department for over 15 years, later said that he had seen house fires, car fires, barn fires, and industrial accidents. He had pulled victims from burning buildings and witnessed the aftermath of intense blazes that had consumed everything in their path. But he had never seen anything like the Bentley bathroom. The localization of the destruction defied everything he understood about how fire behaves. Fire spreads. Fire consumes. Fire moves upward and outward, seeking fuel and oxygen. It does not burn a human body to ash while leaving a slipper intact. It does not create a focused column of destruction while ignoring combustible materials mere feet away. The fire marshal was called in to conduct a formal investigation. His name was never widely publicized, but his testimony became part of the official record. He examined the scene with the meticulous attention to detail that such an inexplicable situation demanded. He measured the hole in the floor. He photographed the remaining leg from multiple angles. He collected samples of the ash from the basement. He interviewed Don Gosnell and the responding firefighters. And then he sat down to write a report that would raise more questions than it answered. The fire marshal noted that cremation of a human body requires sustained temperatures of approximately 1800 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. Professional crematoriums use specially designed furnaces that maintain these extreme temperatures for 2 to 3 hours to reduce a human body to ash and bone fragments. Even under these controlled, intense conditions, bones do not completely disintegrate. They must be mechanically processed after cremation to achieve the fine ash that families receive. Yet, in Dr. Bentley's bathroom, with its wooden floor and standard construction materials, something had generated enough heat to almost completely consume a 92-year-old man. The ash in the basement was fine, powdery, more thoroughly combusted than what even a crematorium typically produces. But here was the impossible part, the detail that elevated this from a tragic accident to an enduring mystery. The materials surrounding the apparent source of heat showed minimal damage. The toilet, which would have been perhaps a foot away from where Dr. Bentley's body must have been, was slightly cracked from heat, but otherwise intact. The linoleum floor showed burning only in the immediate area of the hole. The bathtub, the walls, the wooden door frame, all stood undamaged. A newspaper lying on a shelf in the bathroom was yellowed and brittle with age, but had not ignited. The curtains on the window had not caught fire. The fire marshal's report included technical language about combustion patterns and heat distribution, but the conclusion was inescapable. There was no known mechanism by which such intense, focused heat could be generated in an ordinary bathroom without an external fuel source. If Dr. Bentley had knocked over a kerosene heater, the entire room would have burned. If there had been an electrical fire, the wiring would show evidence of short-circuiting, and the flames would have spread along predictable paths. If someone had deliberately set a fire, accelerant patterns would be evident, and again, the damage would be far more extensive. The investigation considered every conventional explanation. Had Dr. Bentley been smoking and set himself on fire? There was no evidence of cigarettes or tobacco in the room, and besides, clothing fires do not cremate bodies. They char skin and burn flesh, but they extinguish when the fabric is consumed. The human body is approximately 60% water. We do not burn easily or completely. Our bones are dense mineral structures that resist combustion. Our organs and tissues will char and desiccate, but to reduce them to fine ash requires not just heat but sustained, extreme heat over an extended period. Could there have been some kind of chemical reaction? Dr. Bentley had been a physician, and the building had housed his practice for many years. Perhaps there were old chemicals, some volatile substance that had soaked into his clothing? But chemical fires have signatures. They leave residues. They burn in characteristic patterns. And no chemical found in a typical medical office would explain the selective nature of the destruction. Why would Dr. Bentley burn while his walker did not? Why would the floor beneath him combust while the toilet beside him merely cracked? The local community struggled to make sense of what had happened. Dr. Bentley had been a fixture in Coudersport for most of his long life. He had delivered babies, set broken bones, and tended to the sick through epidemics and hard times. He was remembered as a kind man, though increasingly frail in his final years. Neighbors reported that he had been in declining health, that he moved slowly with his walker, that he spent most of his time in the house alone. But there was nothing in his history or circumstances that pointed towards such a bizarre death. Don Gosnell, the meter reader who discovered the scene, reportedly had nightmares for months afterward. The image of that hole in the basement ceiling, the pile of ash, and then later, when he learned what the firefighters had found upstairs, the mental picture of that single leg standing beside the toilet. He told friends that he could not shake the smell, that sweet and terrible odor that had greeted him when he first descended the basement stairs. It was the smell of something that should not happen, of some violation of natural law. The case of Dr. John Irving Bentley became one of the most well-documented instances of what researchers would later term spontaneous human combustion. The phrase itself sounds like something from a sensational tabloid, a lurid claim designed to sell newspapers rather than describe a real phenomenon. And yet, the evidence from that December morning in 1966 resists conventional explanation. The first responders were credible witnesses. The fire marshal was a trained professional. The physical evidence was photographed and documented. This was not a legend passed down through generations, growing more fantastical with each retelling. This was a scene investigated by multiple authorities, all of whom reached the same unsettling conclusion. Something had generated enough heat in that bathroom to cremate a human being, while leaving the surrounding room largely intact. What kind of heat behaves this way? What source of combustion focuses its energy so narrowly that it consumes flesh and bone but spares fabric and wood mere inches away? These questions hung over the investigation like smoke. The fire marshal could document what had happened, but he could not explain how. The evidence was clear. The mechanism remained hidden. And so the house on that Coudersport Street stood as a monument to an impossible event, a place where the normal rules seemed to have been temporarily suspended, where something generated the heat of a crematorium in the space of an ordinary bathroom, then extinguished itself without spreading, leaving behind only ash, a hole, and one inexplicable, slipper-clad leg to prove that Dr. John Irving Bentley had been there at all. The kitchen looked perfectly ordinary that evening in September of 1982. Henry Thomas sat in the modest London home he shared with his daughter Jeannie, a 20-year-old woman whose mental disabilities had required his constant care since childhood. The gas cooker stood cold and unused. No candles flickered on the table. No cigarettes smoldered in ashtrays. Nothing in that unremarkable room suggested that within moments, Henry would witness something that would defy every rational explanation he had ever held about how the world worked. Jeannie sat quietly in a straight-backed kitchen chair, as she often did in the early evening hours. Her father had positioned himself nearby, keeping the gentle watch he had maintained for 2 decades. She was calm that night, peaceful even, showing none of the agitation that sometimes accompanied her condition. Henry would later tell investigators that she seemed content, her hands resting gently in her lap as the autumn light faded beyond the window. What happened next occurred so quickly that Henry's mind struggled to process the sequence of events even as they unfolded before his eyes. He saw a flash of light appear near his daughter's face, a sudden brilliant illumination that seemed to materialize from nowhere. There was no sound accompanying this flash, no crack of electrical discharge, no whoosh of igniting fuel. The light simply appeared, and in that same terrible instant, flames erupted across Jeannie's upper body. Henry would spend the rest of his life trying to explain what he witnessed in those seconds. The fire did not start small and spread, as fires naturally do when they catch fabric or hair. It did not begin from a single point of ignition and travel outward. Instead, the flames seemed to engulf her torso and head simultaneously, as if she had been doused in accelerant and ignited all at once. But there had been no accelerant. There had been nothing. The father's paralysis lasted only a heartbeat before instinct overtook shock. He lunged toward his daughter, his hands already reaching to smother the flames consuming her. His son-in-law, who had been in an adjacent room, came running at the commotion. Together, the two men fought desperately to extinguish the fire that was devouring Jeannie's flesh. They beat at the flames with their bare hands, grabbed whatever fabric they could find to throw over her, pulled her from the chair onto the floor where they could better fight the blaze. Throughout this frantic struggle, Jeannie remained conscious. This detail, perhaps more than any other, haunted those who later heard the account. She did not lose consciousness from shock or pain. She was aware, present in those terrible moments as her father and brother-in-law battled to save her life. The sounds she made, the way she moved, the look in her eyes as the flames were finally beaten out, these images seared themselves into Henry Thomas's memory, with a permanence that no amount of time would ever fade. When the fire was finally extinguished, the men could assess what had happened. Jeannie's upper body had sustained severe burns. The flesh of her torso, shoulders, and face had been ravaged by intense heat. Her clothing had been incinerated in places, charred beyond recognition in others. But her hands, those hands that had been resting quietly in her lap when the flash occurred, remained virtually unburned. This made no sense. If she had been handling something that ignited, if she had struck a match or manipulated any kind of flame source, her hands would have shown the evidence. They showed nothing. The kitchen chair told its own strange story. The wooden seat bore scorch marks where Jeannie had been sitting, evidence of the tremendous heat that had been generated. But the chair had not caught fire. It had not been consumed or even seriously damaged. The scorching was superficial, limited to the immediate area where her body had made contact. The rest of the chair, the floor beneath it, the table beside it, all remained untouched. The fire had been localized in a way that natural combustion simply does not behave. Emergency services arrived and rushed Jeannie to the hospital. The paramedics who transported her documented the extent of her injuries with growing bewilderment. The burn pattern made no sense according to any conventional explanation. There was no trail of accelerant on her clothing. No chemical residue that might indicate an unusual substance had been present. The distribution of the burns suggested an intensity of heat that should have required a sustained and powerful ignition source, yet no such source could be identified. At the hospital, doctors fought to save her life. Burns covering such a large percentage of the body, particularly when they extend to the face and respiratory system, present enormous challenges to treatment. The risk of infection, the fluid loss, the shock to the system, all of these factors compound into a desperate race against time. For 8 days, Jeannie clung to life. For 8 days, her father sat beside her bed, replaying those impossible moments in the kitchen, searching his memory for some detail he might have missed, some rational explanation for what his eyes had witnessed. She died on the 8th day, her body unable to recover from the massive trauma it had sustained. The official cause of death was listed as complications from severe burns, but the cause of those burns remained officially undetermined. Investigators who examined the scene found themselves confronting a puzzle with no solution. They interviewed Henry Thomas multiple times, searching for inconsistencies in his account, hoping to find some detail that would unlock a rational explanation. His story never wavered. He had been watching his daughter. A flash of light appeared. She was suddenly engulfed in flames. There had been no ignition source. The son-in-law corroborated every detail. He had not seen the initial flash, having been in another room, but he had arrived within seconds. The fire had already fully involved Jenny's upper body by the time he entered the kitchen. The speed of the event, the intensity of the flames, the lack of any obvious cause, all of these elements aligned with Henry's account. Other witnesses, neighbors who had rushed to help when they heard the commotion, added their own strange observations. Several commented on the absence of any smell before the fire occurred. House fires typically announce themselves with odors: the scent of gas if there has been a leak, the acrid smell of electrical burning if wiring has failed, the chemical tang of ignited accelerants if arson is involved. But those who were nearby in the moments before Jeannie caught fire reported smelling nothing unusual. The scent of burning flesh and fabric came only after the flames appeared, not before. The lack of any ignition sound also troubled investigators. Gas explosions make noise. Electrical failures typically produce pops or buzzes or the crash of breakers tripping. Even the strike of a match creates a small but audible sound. Yet Henry Thomas, sitting mere feet from his daughter, heard nothing before the flash. The first sound had been the horrible noise of the fire itself, the rush of flames consuming fabric and flesh. Fire investigators brought their expertise to bear on the case. They examined the kitchen with meticulous care, looking for faulty wiring, gas leaks, any mechanical or chemical explanation for spontaneous ignition. They found nothing. The electrical system was old, but functional and properly maintained. The gas lines showed no leaks or damage. There were no flammable liquids stored in the kitchen, no chemicals that might have somehow vaporized and ignited. The room was, in every measurable way, safe. The condition of Jeannie's hands became a focal point of the investigation. Forensic experts understood that this detail was critical. If she had ignited herself, either intentionally or accidentally, her hands would bear evidence of that action. They would show burns, chemical residue, some indication of contact with an ignition source. Medical examiners found nothing. Her hands had been protected somehow, spared from the flames that consumed the rest of her upper body. This pattern was inconsistent with any known mechanism of fire starting. Some investigators privately wondered if Henry Thomas himself might have been involved, if grief or stress, or some unspoken burden of caring for a disabled daughter might have driven him to a terrible act. But this theory collapsed under the weight of the evidence. The son-in-law had been present within seconds. There had been no time for Henry to douse his daughter with accelerant and ignite it. And even if there had been time, where was the accelerant container? Where was the ignition device? The kitchen had been thoroughly searched. Nothing had been found because nothing was there to find. The case of Jeannie Thomas forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. We expect the world to make sense. We expect that for every effect, there must be a cause that we can identify and understand. Fire requires fuel, oxygen, and an ignition source. This is basic chemistry, fundamental science that has been proven countless times. Yet, here was a case where the effect was undeniable. The young woman had been burned, and the cause remained completely elusive. What makes this 1982 London case particularly significant in the study of spontaneous human combustion is the presence of a direct, reliable witness. Henry Thomas was not recalling events from hours earlier or reconstructing what might have happened in an empty room. He was there. He was watching his daughter when she burst into flame. His account provides something that many historical cases lack: immediate testimony from someone who saw the beginning of the event. This moves spontaneous human combustion out of the realm of historical curiosity and into the territory of modern phenomenon. We are no longer talking about cases from the 1700s or 1800s, incidents recorded in dubious documents with questionable reliability. We are talking about an event that occurred in living memory, in a major modern city, investigated by contemporary fire and police departments using 20th century forensic techniques. And despite all of that modern expertise and technology, no explanation was found. The psychological impact of this case extends beyond the immediate tragedy of Jeannie's death. Henry Thomas had to live with what he had witnessed, knowing that most people who heard his account would struggle to believe it. How do you process such an experience? How do you reconcile what your eyes saw with what your mind knows to be impossible? The trauma of watching your child die is unimaginable enough without the added burden of knowing that her death defies explanation. For those who study spontaneous human combustion, the Thomas case represents a kind of watershed moment. It bridges the gap between historical accounts and modern witnessed events. It takes a phenomenon that had been easy to dismiss as legend or misidentification and grounds it in concrete, contemporary testimony. A father watched his daughter catch fire from no identifiable source, and 8 days later she was dead. These are facts, documented in official reports, corroborated by multiple witnesses, investigated by professional authorities. The mystery is not whether it happened. The mystery is how. The morning of December 22, 2010, began like any other winter day in Galway, Ireland. The Atlantic winds pushed cold air through the narrow streets of Ballybane, a quiet residential area where neighbors knew each other's names, and nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen. But inside a modest home on Clareview Park, something impossible was already complete. By the time anyone discovered what had occurred, Michael Faherty no longer existed in any recognizable form. He was 76 years old, a retired man who lived alone. When concerned neighbors noticed something wrong and authorities finally entered his home, they found a scene that would perplex investigators, challenge fire safety experts, and ultimately force a coroner to make a ruling that defied conventional medical explanation. Michael Faherty's body, or what remained of it, lay on the floor near the fireplace in his living room. His torso was almost completely destroyed, burned with an intensity that seemed to come from within rather than without. The flesh, organs, and bone of his central body mass had been reduced to ashen fragments, yet his head remained largely intact. His legs, though burned, were still recognizably human limbs. It was as though the fire had chosen only the core of him, burning with furious selectivity. The room told an even stranger story. The ceiling directly above where he lay showed some fire damage, blackened and cracked from heat. But this damage extended only about 3 feet in any direction. The floor beneath him was scorched, yet the furniture mere inches away remained untouched. A television set near his body showed no melting, no heat warping. Books on a nearby shelf had not ignited. The walls bore minimal smoke staining. The Christmas cards he had received and displayed stood upright, unsinged. His fireplace had been lit, containing ordinary peat and wood ash consistent with a normal fire, nothing unusual or particularly hot. Everything about the scene suggested that tremendous heat had been generated in an impossibly small area, consuming Michael Faherty almost entirely while leaving the room around him relatively unscathed. Fire investigators arrived expecting to find the usual culprits. Accelerants, perhaps. Some overlooked source of ignition. Faulty electrical wiring. Gas leaks. Natural causes that had been missed at first glance. They found none of these things. Forensic teams swept the scene for chemical residues that would indicate gasoline, lighter fluid, or any substance that could have been poured on the man to create such intense burning. The tests came back negative. Every sample, every swab, every careful analysis revealed nothing. No accelerant had been used. The electrical systems in the home were examined and found to be functioning normally, with no signs of short circuits or sparking that could have started a fire. The gas lines were intact and leak-free. There was simply no external source that could account for what had happened to Michael Faherty. The pathologist who examined his remains faced a puzzle that challenged everything in his training. The temperature required to reduce a human torso to the state they found defied easy explanation. Human bone is remarkably resilient. It takes sustained heat of approximately 1400 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit to completely consume bone, which is why crematoriums must maintain such high temperatures for extended period. Even then, fragments remain that must be mechanically pulverized. Yet Michael Faherty's torso had burned far more completely than many cremated bodies, and it had happened in a domestic living room with no industrial heating equipment. The heat had to have been even greater than standard cremation temperatures, possibly exceeding 2000 degrees Fahrenheit in localized areas. But there was no fuel source present that could generate such extreme heat. Coroner Kieran McLaughlin was left with an impossible decision. He reviewed every piece of evidence. He consulted with fire safety officers who had decades of experience investigating house fires and deaths. He examined the pathology reports multiple times. He looked for any conventional explanation that could account for the totality of the evidence before him. In the end, he found none. On September 23, 2011, after a thorough inquest, Coroner McLaughlin made a ruling that would send ripples through forensic communities worldwide. He officially declared that Michael Faherty had died from spontaneous human combustion. It was the first time in living memory that an Irish coroner had made such a ruling. It remains one of the only official verdicts of its kind in modern legal history. The coroner stated clearly that this was a conclusion, reached only after all other possibilities had been exhausted. He acknowledged how extraordinary it sounded. But the evidence, or rather the lack of any evidence pointing to conventional causes, left him with no alternative explanation that fit the fact. Michael Faherty had somehow burned from within, generating heat sufficient to consume his own body, fueled by nothing investigators could identify. This official ruling transformed spontaneous human combustion from folklore into documented reality, at least in one legal jurisdiction. But it also opened a darker line of questioning that few wanted to fully explore. If Michael Faherty could be reduced to ashen fragments in his own living room with minimal trace evidence, what about cases where there was no living room at all? What about the people who simply vanished, leaving nothing behind? Every year, thousands of people are reported missing. The vast majority are eventually found, alive or deceased, their fates explained by conventional means. But a persistent percentage simply disappear without trace. No body is ever recovered. No evidence of foul play emerges. No witnesses come forward. They are there one day, gone the next, leaving families with nothing but absence and unanswered questions. We assume abduction, murder with exceptional body disposal, accidental death in remote locations where remains are scattered by animals or weather. We build psychological profiles of likely scenarios. But what if some of these disappearances have a different explanation entirely? Consider the physics of what happened to Michael Faherty. Had he been alone in a field instead of a living room? Had there been no ceiling to scorch and no floor to burn? What would investigators have found? Perhaps a small pile of ash that wind could scatter in minutes. Perhaps nothing at all. The same intense, localized heat that consumed his torso would have reduced him to particles light enough to be carried away by the slightest breeze. Bone fragments that might have survived could be mistaken for animal remains or overlooked entirely in grass or soil. A human being could effectively vanish, leaving no evidence that they had ever been in that location. This is not mere speculation. There are documented cases where people were found in states of combustion that left almost nothing behind. The case of Jeannie Saffin in 1982 saw a mentally disabled woman burst into flames while sitting in her kitchen in London. Her father witnessed it happen. There was no external ignition source. She was engulfed in seconds. When the flames were extinguished, massive burning had occurred, yet the chair she sat in was barely damaged. Had she been alone, had no one witnessed the initial combustion, the fire might have burned itself out, leaving only a residue that could be wiped away or swept up, mistaken for ordinary ash. In 1951, Mary Reeser of St. Petersburg, Florida, was found reduced to a pile of ashes, a skull shrunk to the size of a baseball, and one foot still wearing a slipper. The foot had been outside the primary burn area. Everything else was gone. The apartment showed minimal fire damage beyond the chair she had been sitting in. Fire investigators calculated that temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit would have been necessary to achieve such complete combustion of bone and tissue. No explanation was ever found for how such heat could be generated and sustained in that apartment. Had Mary Reeser been outdoors, had the skull and foot also been consumed or carried away, she would have simply disappeared. A missing person case with no remains to investigate. The truly horrifying mathematics begin when you consider how many missing persons cases involve someone last seen alone, in their home or in isolated locations. How many involve people who lived solitary lives, whose absence might not be noticed for days or weeks? If spontaneous human combustion is real, and the evidence from Galway suggests it is, then it follows logically that not every instance would be discovered. For every Michael Faherty whose remains are found and puzzled over, there could be others who burnt completely to vapor and ash with no one present to witness. No structure to show scorch marks, no evidence left behind at all. The mechanism remains unknown. Theories range from the ignition of body gases to unusual chemical reactions within human tissue, from static electricity buildup to something even stranger that science has not yet identified. But the common thread in verified cases is the intensity of the heat and how localized it remains. Temperatures that should spread, that should ignite everything nearby, instead seem to focus almost exclusively on the human body itself. This suggests something intrinsic to the person burning, not an external fire source. And if the ignition is internal, if the fuel is somehow the body itself, then the process could theoretically occur anywhere, anytime, to anyone. Forensic databases contain hundreds of cases where missing persons were never found despite extensive searches. Some of these involve water, where drowning in currents can explain the absence of remains. Others involve wilderness areas vast enough to hide bodies indefinitely. But there are also cases in urban areas, in apartments and homes, where someone simply ceases to exist between one day and the next. Neighbors hear nothing. Security cameras show the person entering, but never leaving. Yet comprehensive searches find no trace. No blood evidence, no signs of struggle, no body. The assumption is always hidden homicide, a killer skilled enough to remove all evidence. But what if some of these scenes are so clean because there was no killer? What if the person combusted alone, burned to fine ash, and the ash was vacuumed up or washed away before anyone realized it was human remains? The ash from a completely burned human body, if scattered or diluted, becomes virtually indistinguishable from common dust and debris. Without bone fragments to analyze, without teeth for dental comparison, there is nothing to identify. DNA denatures at high temperatures. Soft tissue vaporizes. The organic material breaks down into basic carbon and minerals. A person could be reduced to less than a pound of powder, scattered by wind or washed down a drain, leaving literally nothing for investigators to find. This is the darkness at the heart of the Michael Faherty case. Not just that it happened, but that it was caught. That circumstances aligned to preserve enough evidence for a ruling to be made. How many others were not caught? How many times has this happened in the middle of the night, in empty homes, to people who would not be missed for weeks? The remains swept up by cleaners who thought they were dealing with fireplace ash or dirt. The fine powder of what was once a human being, disposed of as ordinary household waste. Fire investigators privately acknowledge that spontaneous human combustion cases share characteristics that trouble them deeply. The heat levels are inconsistent with available fuel. The localized nature of the burning defies normal fire behavior. The completeness of the combustion suggests sustained temperatures that should not be possible in domestic environments. Yet, they happen. Rarely, but repeatedly. Documented across centuries, across continents, in circumstances where fraud or misidentification seem impossible. Michael Faherty was lucky in the grimmest sense. He left enough behind to be found, to be examined, to receive a ruling. He left evidence that forced authorities to acknowledge something beyond their understanding. But he may not be alone. He may simply be the visible example of something that happens more often than we know, to people who leave even less behind than he did. The missing who are not missing, but gone. Vanished into ash too fine to find, scattered into nothing, their disappearances forever unexplained, because the true explanation is too impossible to seriously consider. Somewhere tonight, someone may simply stop existing, consumed by fire that has no source, leaving behind only questions and empty spaces where a person used to be. The coroner stood in the small apartment, staring at what remained of Mary Reeser. It was 1951, and nothing in his 20 years of experience had prepared him for this. The 67-year-old woman had been reduced to less than 10 pounds of ash and bone fragments. Her skull had shrunk to the size of a baseball, yet the walls of her room showed minimal damage. The chair she had been sitting in was mostly intact below seat level. A pile of newspapers just 3 feet away hadn't even browned. And this impossible scene would haunt investigators for decades, because no matter which theory they applied, nothing could explain what they were seeing. Scientists have tried for over a century to rationalize spontaneous human combustion. They've developed theories, conducted experiments, built elaborate models to prove that what witnesses describe simply cannot happen. And yet, every single explanation falls apart when confronted with the actual evidence. The wick effect, acetone buildup, electrical phenomena, methane production. Each sounds plausible in a laboratory. Each crumbles at a crime scene. Let's start with the wick effect, the theory most scientists cling to with desperate certainty. According to this explanation, human bodies can burn like candles. Clothing or a nearby flame ignites the victim's clothes. The fabric acts as a wick, while body fat melts and fuels the fire. Proponents point to experiments where they wrapped pig carcasses in cloth, ignited them, and observed slow, sustained burning. For hours, the fat rendered and fed the flames, reducing flesh to ash without setting the surrounding area ablaze. Case closed, they declared. Spontaneous human combustion explained. Except it doesn't explain anything at all. The wick effect requires an external ignition source. It requires the victim to remain stationary for hours while their body slowly burns. It cannot account for the extreme temperatures necessary to reduce bone to ash. Normal house fires burn at temperatures between 10 and 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. The wick effect produces similar temperatures, perhaps slightly higher in optimal conditions. But human bone requires temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit to turn to ash. Crematoriums use specially designed furnaces that reach 3,200 degrees and still need 2 to 3 hours to reduce a body to cremains. Even then, large bone fragments remain and must be mechanically pulverized. Mary Reeser's bones were ash. Not fragments. Ash. Her skull had shrunk, something that only occurs at temperatures above 3,000 degrees. The wick effect has never been shown to produce anything close to this heat. Moreover, pig experiments show extensive charring of surrounding materials. Tables scorch. Floors burn through. Walls blacken. But in case after case of suspected spontaneous human combustion, the damage remains bizarrely localized. A woman burns to ash in her chair while curtains inches away show no damage. A man's torso is reduced to cinders, but the wooden floor beneath him merely chars slightly. Then there's the acetone theory. Some researchers propose that certain medical conditions could cause acetone to build up in the body. Diabetics in ketoacidosis, alcoholics with damaged livers, people on extreme diets. The acetone, being flammable, could supposedly ignite and cause the body to burn from within. This theory gained traction in the 1930s and 40s when researchers noticed that several victims had been heavy drinkers or had diabetes. But acetone has an ignition temperature of 869 degrees Fahrenheit. Something would still need to heat the body to this point before ignition could occur. And even if acetone somehow ignited inside a living person, it would cause an explosion or flash fire, not the slow, thorough cremation observed in these cases. Medical literature contains no verified cases of internal acetone combustion. Moreover, many spontaneous combustion victims showed no signs of acetoacidosis or any condition that would cause acetone buildup. They were healthy individuals who simply burned. The electrical theory emerged in the late 20th century, suggesting that the human body might generate or accumulate static electricity to the point of causing ignition. Some researchers pointed to rare cases of electrical burns with no external source. Others hypothesized about piezoelectric effects in bone or unusual bioelectrical buildups. It sounds almost scientific until you examine what would actually be required. The human body operates on millivolts and milliohms. Even the most powerful neural impulses generate a fraction of the energy needed to ignite cloth or skin. There is no known biological mechanism for accumulating or discharging electricity at levels sufficient to start a fire, let alone sustain one hot enough to reduce bone to ash. Then came the methane hypothesis. The human digestive system produces methane gas through bacterial action. Perhaps, some theorize, a buildup of intestinal gas could ignite, causing internal combustion. But methane disperses quickly. It doesn't accumulate in concentrations necessary for sustained burning. And even if it did, even if someone somehow retained enough methane to fuel a fire, it would cause an explosion, not the slow consuming burns documented in spontaneous combustion cases. Witnesses never report explosions. They report finding bodies that have burned for hours, slowly, thoroughly, impossibly. Every theory fails, and researchers know it. In 1984, a team of forensic scientists attempted to recreate the conditions of spontaneous human combustion in a controlled environment. They used pig carcasses as human analogs, dressed them in various fabrics, placed them in furnished rooms, and introduced ignition sources. They tried different positions, different materials, different ventilation conditions. They monitored temperatures, documented burn patterns, measured the destruction. Over 3 years, they conducted dozens of experiments. Not once did they achieve the results seen in actual cases. Not once did they produce the complete cremation, the shrunken skull, the localized damage, the ash-reduced bone. Their fires either spread and consumed the room, or they burned out before reducing the body to anything resembling the victims of spontaneous human combustion. In 2005, another research team tried again. They used more sophisticated equipment, better temperature monitoring, enhanced modeling. They reviewed every documented case, identified common factors, and designed experiments to test specific scenarios. They worked with crematorium experts to understand the temperatures and conditions needed for complete bone reduction. They studied fire dynamics, thermal radiation, heat transfer. After 2 years of intensive research, they published their findings. The conclusion was unsettling. Under controlled conditions, with optimal fuel sources and ignition, they could not replicate the damage patterns seen in spontaneous human combustion cases. The temperatures required simply didn't occur. The localized nature of the burns defied fire dynamics. Something about these cases didn't match any known combustion process. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect isn't what burns. It's how it burns. In 1982, a woman named Jeannie Saffin burst into flames while sitting in her kitchen. Her father and son-in-law witnessed it. She didn't cry out. She didn't struggle. Flames erupted from her body, bright and intense, consuming her where she sat. Her father tried to smother the fire with a coat, but the flames seemed to come from within her. By the time they extinguished the blaze, she had suffered massive burns. She died 8 days later. The coroner could find no external ignition source, no accelerant, no chemical residue. The burns suggested temperatures far exceeding any normal fire. And most disturbing of all, the autopsy revealed something that shouldn't be possible. Her internal organs showed more damage than her skin. The burning had occurred from the inside out. This pattern appears again and again in the most severe cases. Bodies with internal organs reduced to ash while patches of skin remain intact. Torsos completely consumed while limbs show only superficial burning. Why? It violates everything we know about fire dynamics. Flames consume from the outside in. Heat transfers from external sources inward. A body cannot burn from the inside out unless the heat source is internal, and there is no known internal heat source capable of sustaining the 3,000+ degree temperatures required. Dr. John Bentley, a 92-year-old physician, was found in his bathroom in 1966. Most of his body had been reduced to ash. His leg below the knee remained intact, still wearing his slipper. The wooden floor beneath him had burned through, dropping the ashes into the crawl space below. But the bathroom itself showed minimal damage. The bathtub, inches away, was undamaged. Paint on the walls hadn't blistered. His walker stood nearby, its rubber grips unmelted. Fire investigators couldn't explain it. The burn pattern suggested intense, localized heat far exceeding normal combustion temperatures, yet the fire hadn't spread. It had consumed Dr. Bentley almost entirely and then simply stopped. In case after case, victims show no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no attempts to escape or call for help. It's as if they were paralyzed, or dead before the burning began, or somehow unaware that their bodies were being consumed by impossible heat. Witnesses who've seen people ignite describe a strange passivity. The victims don't react as burning people should. They don't scream or flail or run. They sit or stand, engulfed in flames, making no attempt to save themselves. This has led some researchers to propose that death occurs before combustion, that some unknown process kills the victim instantly, and then the burning begins. But autopsies, when possible, show death by burning. Smoke inhalation. thermal damage. The victims were alive when they burned. They simply didn't react. And the phenomenon hasn't stopped. It didn't end in the mysterious past with Victorian-era cases that could be dismissed as folklore or misidentification. In 2010, an Irish man named Michael Faherty was found burned to death in his living room. The coroner's report stated that his death was consistent with spontaneous human combustion. Firefighters found his body lying with his head near the fireplace, but the fire itself wasn't responsible for his death. The room showed minimal damage. The ceiling above him was scorched, but nothing else had caught fire. His body had been almost completely consumed. The chief fire investigator stated publicly that he had never seen anything like it in his decades of experience. The burn pattern didn't match any known fire scenario. The intensity of the heat required to cause such destruction should have burned the house down. Instead, it had destroyed Michael Faherty and almost nothing else. In 2013, a 65-year-old man in Oklahoma was found in his living room, reduced to ash from the waist up. His legs remained relatively intact. The chair he'd been sitting in was barely damaged. The hardwood floor showed some charring, but nothing consistent with the heat needed to cremate a human torso. Investigators ruled out foul play. No accelerants were present. No external ignition sources could be identified. The case remains open, classified as death by unknown causes, though the burn pattern matches dozens of historical spontaneous combustion cases. In 2015, a woman in London burned to death in her apartment. Neighbors reported no smell of smoke, no fire alarms, nothing unusual until her body was discovered 3 days later. The apartment showed no fire damage except for the area immediately surrounding her remains. She had been reduced to ash and bone fragments. The temperature required for this level of destruction should have triggered the building's fire suppression system, should have filled the hallway with smoke, should have burned through the floor into the apartment below. None of this happened. She simply burned, alone, at impossible temperatures, leaving almost no trace except her ashes. These aren't medieval mysteries or folklore from superstitious times. These are modern cases, investigated with contemporary forensic science, documented with photography, and advanced testing, examined by experts who understand fire dynamics and human anatomy. And still, no explanation fits the evidence. The scientific community largely refuses to acknowledge spontaneous human combustion as a distinct phenomenon. To do so would require admitting that something occurs in nature that we cannot explain, cannot predict, cannot prevent. It would mean accepting that human bodies can somehow generate or focus heat far beyond anything our physics can account for. It would mean confronting the possibility that under certain unknown conditions, a person can simply burn from the inside out at crematorium temperatures while sitting in their living room. The theories fail because they're trying to fit impossible evidence into known parameters. But the bodies don't lie. The crime scenes don't lie. Something reduces human beings to ash while leaving their surroundings largely intact. Something generates heat that exceeds anything the human body should be capable of producing. Something kills without warning and burns without spreading. And it's still happening. Right now, somewhere, it could be happening. There's no way to predict it. No known risk factors that consistently appear in all cases, no prevention or protection. It has happened to the young and old, healthy and sick, in winter and summer, in homes and outdoors. The only certainty is that it defies explanation, and that someday, perhaps soon, investigators will stand in another room, staring at another pile of ash that used to be a person, searching for answers that science cannot provide. After decades of investigation, after countless theories proposed and discarded, after laboratories have attempted and failed to recreate the phenomenon, we are left with a catalog of mysteries that refuse resolution. The patterns themselves become part of the enigma. Why are the victims predominantly elderly? Statistical analysis shows that roughly 75 to 80% of recorded cases involve individuals over the age of 60. This observation has spawned theories about bodily composition, about accumulated fat stores, about reduced mobility. Yet these explanations crumble when we examine the outliers, the cases that don't conform. Young victims exist in the record. Healthy, active individuals who should not, according to any proposed mechanism, have succumbed to such destruction. Why are they so often alone? The solitary nature of these deaths has led some to propose behavioral explanations, suggestions of smoking accidents or proximity to heat sources. But this reasoning fails to account for the witnessed cases, the incidents where family members or neighbors observed the ignition itself, describing flames that erupted from within, that consumed with impossible speed and terrible precision. And what of the temporal clustering? Fire investigators have noted that certain months show higher incidences of spontaneous human combustion. Winter months appear more frequently in the data, leading to speculation about heating sources, about closed rooms, and poor ventilation. Yet cases occur in summer too, in open spaces, defying these environmental explanations. The evidence itself contradicts every major theory we've constructed. The lack of external fuel sources at many scenes challenges conventional fire science. The extreme localization, where a human body burns to ash while the carpet beneath remains intact, violates our understanding of fire behavior. The speed of consumption, reducing bone to fragments in time frames that should be impossible, mocks our laboratory experiments. Nearby flammables survive untouched. Curtains hang undamaged inches from cremated remains. Newspapers sit readable beside piles of ash. These scenes defy the fundamental principles of combustion, of heat transfer, of simple physics. If this is a natural phenomenon, if there exists some combination of circumstances that can reduce a human body to ash in its own living room, why can't we reproduce it under controlled conditions? Researchers have tried. They have attempted to create the exact circumstances described in historical cases. They have failed consistently and completely. The statistical reality remains undeniable. Several cases occur each year worldwide, documented by fire investigators who cannot explain what they're witnessing. As you listen to these words, somewhere on this planet, someone might be at risk from a phenomenon we cannot predict, cannot prevent, and cannot fully understand. In firehouses and investigation bureaus across the world, experienced professionals still encounter scenes that defy explanation, still photograph evidence that contradicts their training, still write reports concluding that the human body remains capable of mysteries that science has not yet decoded. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.